Imagine this. You spend, I don't know, 50 years and hundreds of billions of dollars building the ultimate emergency fail-safe system.
Okay.
You find these massive, naturally occurring salt caverns deep beneath the Earth's surface. You hollow them out, you fortify them, and then you pump hundreds of millions of barrels of crude oil down into them.
Right. A massive strategic reserve.
Exactly. And you draft impossibly complex international treaties to protect this supply. You create entire geopolitical military doctrines. You build carrier strike groups, map out strategic alliances.
Yeah, a massive undertaking.
All of this devoting vast resources over half a century just to ensure that no matter what happens in the world, war, embargo, a natural disaster, you will never, ever run out of gas for your car. You secure the energy to power your
It
civilization.
makes sense. It's prudent.
It is. But in the midst of all that brilliant paranoid planning, all that spending, and all that strategic doctrine, you completely forget to build a fail-safe for the actual food you eat.
Yeah. It sounds like, it sounds like the premise of a dystopian science fiction novel, right?
Totally.
Like the kind of glaring, almost absurd oversight a screenwriter invents just to force a plot forward. But it isn't fiction. What you just described is the exact, literal, architectural reality of the global food system we are living inside right now.
It's wild.
We engineered a fortress for our petroleum, and we just left our caloric survivals sitting completely out in the open.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We're looking at a situation that is unfolding literally as we speak. It is a massive real-time crisis that is actively reshaping the world right now in March of 2026.
And it's moving fast.
Very fast. We're pulling our insights today from a truly fascinating and honestly pretty terrifying piece of analysis by Shinaka Anselm Pereira. It's titled The Nitrogen Trap.
It's a brilliant piece of work.
It really is. And our mission today is to map out this crisis, but we're going to do it a bit differently. We're taking a strict systems thinking perspective.
Right, because if you just look at the headlines, what do you see? You see a geopolitical conflict in the Middle East. You see, military assets moving around the board.
Usual stuff.
Exactly. But that is just the surface layer. What we are really going to track today is how the effective closure of a single 21-mile wide body of water, the Strait of Hormuz, is actively fracturing the global food system, the pharmaceutical system, and, incredibly, even the plastic system.
It really is a masterclass in how fragile our interconnected world actually is.
Unbelievably fragile.
We're going to look at the lateral shocks, like how a localized conflict thousands of miles away actually dictates whether a farmer in Iowa can afford to plant corn this week.
Or whether a generic drug manufacturer in India has the chemical feedstocks to produce your blood pressure medicine.
Right. We are going to explore the mechanics of this collapse and, crucially, what structural mitigations could possibly prevent a total systemic failure. Because right now, the system is buckling. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
We need to start with the absolute foundation. We really need to understand the invisible architecture that keeps you, me, and roughly half the people on this planet breathing and walking around.
To really grasp the fragility we're dealing with here, we have to talk about the carrying capacity of Earth.
Okay.
If we rolled the clock back and relied strictly on natural pre-industrial processes, things like biological fixation by leguminous bacteria in the soil.
Like soybeans and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or the nitrogen created by lightning strikes, or just mining natural deposits of guano. If we just relied on that, the planet's agricultural carrying capacity has a hard mathematical ceiling.
A hard limit on how many humans can eat.
Yes. Based on the available arable land, that natural ceiling would max out at approximately 4 billion people.
4 billion. But if you look at the global population ticker right now, we're sitting at, what, 8 billion people?
8 billion. The arithmetic is brutal, but it's undeniable. Roughly half of the global population, 4 billion human beings, are entirely dependent on synthetic nitrogen fertilizer to exist.
Wow.
It is the metabolic engine of modern human civilization. And every single granule of that fertilizer traces its lineage back to what is arguably the most consequential invention in human history.
The Haber-Bosch process.
Exactly. Developed between 1909 and 1913.
You often hear people debate the greatest inventions, like the internet, the printing press, splitting the atom. But when you look at the raw math of human survival, Haber-Bosch sits at the very top. Without it, half of us simply aren't here.
Yeah, it's not an exaggeration. What is genuinely fascinating about Haber-Bosch is the underlying chemistry, because the thermodynamics of this process are exactly what created the geographical trap we are in today.
How so?
Well, think about our atmosphere. Nitrogen makes up, what, 78% of the air we breathe?
Right.
It is quite literally all around us. It's bathing every leaf of every plant on Earth. But atmospheric nitrogen exists as N2. That is, two nitrogen atoms bound together by an incredibly strong triple covalent bond.
Okay.
It is one of the strongest chemical bonds in nature. Plants cannot break that bond. To them, N2 is completely inert. It's useless. They need reactive nitrogen, meaning nitrogen that has been fixed into ammonia or nitrate.
I always think about it like being stranded in a lifeboat in the middle of the Pacific Ocean.
Oh, I like this.
You are dying of thirst, and there are literally millions of gallons of water right in front of you splashing over the sides of the boat. But you can't drink it because of the salt.
That is a perfect analogy.
The nitrogen is right there in the air, but the corn and the wheat are basically starving to death because they can't digest it.
That's a brilliant way to visualize it. So, Fritz Haber and Carl Bosch, they figured out how to be the desalination plant for that ocean of nitrogen.
But it's not easy.
Not at all. Breaking that triple covalent bond requires a staggering amount of brute force. You need extreme heat. We're talking 400 to 500 degrees Celsius.
Jeez.
And you need immense pressure, like between 150 and 300 times normal atmospheric pressure. You force the atmospheric nitrogen to combine with hydrogen gas over an iron catalyst, and out comes anhydrous ammonia.
And that ammonia is the foundational building block for all synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, like urea.
Right. But here is the catch. Where do you get the hydrogen, and where do you get the massive thermal energy to generate that kind of heat and pressure?
You get it from natural gas, methane.
Yes. And because the energy requirements are so astronomical, the cost of the natural gas dictates the entire economic viability of the operation.
Obvious.
So if you are a massive chemical company, you are going to set up your multi-billion-dollar Haber-Bosch factory wherever natural gas is the absolute cheapest and most abundant on the planet.
Which brings us to geography.
Yeah.
And geography in this case is destiny, because nowhere on Earth is natural gas cheaper to haul out of the ground than the Persian Gulf.
Specifically, they have massive reserves of what is known as sour natural gas.
Let's define that, because sour gas comes up a lot when you look at energy markets. What actually makes it sour?
Sour gas simply means the natural gas contains a high concentration of hydrogen sulfide. It literally smells like rotten eggs, hence the term sour.
Oh, gotcha.
Because it requires extra processing to strip out that sulfur before it can be used for normal commercial energy grids, it is incredibly cheap to use as an industrial feedstock right at the source.
We don't have to transport it or clean it up as much.
Exactly. This localized thermodynamic reality has basically turned the Persian Gulf into the undisputed king of global nitrogen fertilizer production. We are talking about manufacturing at a scale that is difficult for the human brain to fully comprehend.
The production figures in the source text are staggering. You have Qatar's QAFCO complex. It is the largest single-site urea exporter on Earth, pumping out over 5.6 million tons every single year.
It's just massive.
Then you have Saudi Arabia's SABIC, producing roughly 5 million tons. The United Arab Emirates Fertiglobe doing 6.6 million tons.
Yep.
Oman is shipping 1.65 million tons just to India alone. In pre-war, Iran was exporting 5 to 6 million tons a year.
If you look at a map of those facilities, they all sit right there on the western shore of the Persian Gulf. They're basically massive, sprawling industrial cities of steel pipes and compression turbines.
Yeah.
And every single ton of that exported urea, all those millions of tons of life-sustaining ammonia, has to reach the global market by ship. There are no alternative overland pipelines for this.
No rail networks that bypass the water.
None. There is no rail network.
So all of those ships have to exit the Gulf. And to exit the Gulf, they have to pass through the Strait of Hormuz.
A strait that, at its narrowest shipping lane, is just 21 miles wide.
I really want you, the listener, to visualize this. Imagine taking the oxygen supply for half the people on Earth and routing it through a single 21-mile-wide hallway.
It's terrifying when you put it like that.
A hallway that just happens to be located in one of the most historically volatile, heavily militarized regions on the planet. The sheer concentration of risk is almost unbelievable once you see it.
It is the ultimate single point of failure. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, tracks this data closely. They estimate that roughly 1/3 of all global seaborne fertilizer trade passes through that specific 21-mile corridor.
1/3.
Yeah, and the Fertilizer Institute's data is even more stark. They say exporters exposed to this specific region account for nearly 49% of global urea exports and nearly 30% of global ammonia exports.
Which brings us to the inciting incident. Late February 2026, Operation Epic Fury. The United States and Israel launch a massive, highly coordinated air campaign targeting Iranian infrastructure. And from a strictly kinetic military standpoint, the operation is highly effective, right?
Oh, absolutely. Iran's conventional military capability, their air defenses, their radar installations, they're all severely degraded.
But the physical missiles falling from the sky aren't the real story of the blockade, are they?
No, the kinetic strikes are just the catalyst. If we look at this through a systems lens, we have to look at the asymmetric response.
What do you mean by asymmetric?
Well, Iran's leadership knew they couldn't match American air power plane for plane, so they leveraged the only dominant card they held, their geography.
Ah.
They turned the Strait of Hormuz into a commercial killbox. They didn't need to sink every single ship. They just needed to create an unacceptable level of random lethal volatility.
So how do they do that?
They deployed shore-to-sea projectiles, loitering munitions.
Suicide drones, basically.
Yes, suicide drones. And naval mines scattered in the shipping lanes.
And the immediate result of that was that commercial traffic through Hormuz dropped by 97% within a matter of days.
97%.
That is a hard, sudden stop on the metabolic engine of the world.
It is. But the mechanism of that stop is where the real systemic vulnerability lies. You might assume the strait closed simply because ship captains were terrified of taking a missile to the bridge.
Which is a fair assumption.
Physical fear is a factor, of course. But the true architectural fracture, the thing that legally and definitively sealed the strait, was paperwork.
The paperwork. Here is where it gets really interesting. The global maritime insurance architecture. This is something nobody thinks about until it breaks.
Exactly.
Walk us through how a bunch of actuaries sitting in offices in London actually possess the power to stop global shipping.
It's a fascinating and deeply misunderstood mechanism. We would naturally focus on the physical reality, right? The drones, the wolf ships.
Because it's visible.
Right. But global trade fundamentally runs on legal and financial frameworks. If those frameworks evaporate, the physical ships cannot move, period. In the first week of March 2026, the major protection and indemnity clubs, known as P&I clubs, issued coordinated 72-hour cancellation notices for war risk coverage in the Persian Gulf.
Okay, let's translate that. What exactly is a P&I club?
A P&I club is essentially a mutual insurance association. Instead of going to a massive corporate insurer like AIG or Alliance, ship owners pool their money together to insure each other against third-party liability.
Liability.
It covers things like environmental damage if there's an oil spill, or injury to the crew, or wreck removal if a ship sinks. These mutual pools are massive. They cover roughly 90% of the world's ocean-going tonnage.
I'm picturing it like a neighborhood association. Let's say 10 neighbors all chip in $100 a year to cover the cost of a shared lawnmower breaking down.
I like this.
If one neighbor hits a rock and breaks the blade, the pool pays for it. It works great because the odds of all 10 lawnmowers breaking on the exact same afternoon are virtually zero.
That is a perfect structural analogy. The mutual pool relies on the mathematical improbability of correlated simultaneous losses. But what happens to your neighborhood pool if a meteor strikes the street and destroys all 10 lawnmowers at the exact same second?
The pool goes instantly bankrupt.
Precisely. And that meteor, in this case, is a war in the Persian Gulf.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And the P&I clubs aren't operating in the Wild West. They are highly regulated. Specifically, they operate under the European Union's Solvency II directive.
Solvency II, okay.
This directive legally requires these insurers to maintain massive capital reserves. They must hold enough cash on hand to survive a 1 in 200-year loss event.
A 1 in 200-year event. That is an enormous amount of capital they just have to sit on doing nothing.
It is. But you have to factor in the chronological context of early 2026. The world wasn't starting from a place of peace. The Red Sea shipping crisis, driven by Houthi militant attacks on vessels near Yemen, had already been going on for 26 consecutive months.
Oh, right. So the insurers were already bleeding.
The insurance market had been bleeding capital for over 2 years. Those Solvency II buffers were already severely depleted.
So the neighborhood pool was already running low on cash because a few lawnmowers had been getting vandalized over the last 2 years.
Yes. And then the Persian Gulf ignited. Suddenly, you had a massive concentration of incredibly high-value vessels, roughly 100 to 120 massive tankers and bulk carriers, either trapped inside the Gulf or actively transiting the conflict zone.
Hitting ducks.
Sitting ducks. The potential for a correlated loss event, say 5 massive chemical tankers hitting naval mines in the same 48-hour window, completely exceeded the aggregate limits that their remaining capital could legally support under the Solvency II regulations.
Wait, so it wasn't just that the P&I clubs didn't want to insure the ships. They legally couldn't.
Exactly. They were forced by EU law to issue those 72-hour cancellation notices. And once you lose your P&I coverage, you are in breach of your maritime mortgage covenants, you are in breach of port authority rules, and you are operating illegally.
So you literally can't dock anywhere.
Right. The ships drop anchor. They stop moving.
But wait, there are specialist underwriters, right? Like the syndicates at Lloyd's of London who will insure anything for the right price. If you really need to move that cargo, can't you just go to the open market and buy temporary war risk coverage?
You can, absolutely, but the pricing mechanism breaks down entirely. When the mutual pools collapsed, those remaining specialist underwriters had total pricing power in a high-risk environment.
Supply and demand.
Exactly. The baseline premium for war risk coverage before the conflict was roughly 0.1% of a vessel's hull value. During the first week of March, those premiums absolutely skyrocketed to between 1.5 and 5.0% for a single 7-day transit through the Gulf.
Let's do the math on that because the numbers are staggering when you scale them up.
Yeah.
Let's say you have a standard bulk carrier and the ship itself is valued at $50 million.
Okay.
At the peacetime rate of 0.1%, your insurance for that 7-day trip is $25,000. It's basically a rounding error in international logistics. But at 5%.
At 5%, that exact same 7-day transit insurance policy now costs over $2 million.
$2 million, just for the privilege of sailing for 1 week. And here is where the cargo matters, right?
Nice.
Because if you are moving a ship full of advanced semiconductors or high-end luxury vehicles, maybe the margin on that cargo can absorb a $2 million insurance tax. But we are talking about urea.
Urea is a bulk, relatively low-margin commodity. The economics of the fertilizer trade simply become totally prohibitive at those premium levels. A shipment of urea cannot absorb a multi-million-dollar war risk premium. The profit margin flips deeply negative.
So the ships stop moving because they legally and financially cannot afford to move, completely independent of the physical kinetic danger. The paperwork literally creates a physical blockade.
That's systems thinking in a nutshell.
Okay, I have to push back here because this is where governments usually step in. The U.S. government recognized this exact problem, right?
I did.
The U.S. International Development Finance Corporation announced a $20 billion sovereign-backed maritime reinsurance plan, and they partnered with Chubb, the massive private insurer. $20 billion is a massive sovereign guarantee. Why doesn't that instantly clear the logjam? If I'm a ship owner and the U.S. government says, hey, we will cover the cost if you sink, why aren't I ordering my captain to sail?
It's a completely logical question, and it highlights the ultimate limitation of financial instruments in the face of physical violence. You have to look at what insurance actually does.
Right.
Insurance pays for financial loss. If your 100,000-ton ship hits a naval mine and sinks to the bottom of the Gulf, Chubb and the U.S. government will write your corporation a check for $50 million. Your shareholders are made whole.
Right. Everybody gets paid.
But an insurance policy does not intersect an incoming anti-ship cruise missile. A piece of paper does not sweep the water from magnetic naval mines. And most importantly, an insurance payout does not protect the lives of the 25 civilian seafarers living on that vessel.
That's true.
You cannot write a check to bring a crew member back to life.
And the seafarers' unions are incredibly powerful in global shipping, aren't they?
Extremely powerful. Organizations like the International Transport Workers Federation, the ITF, they will simply designate the area a warlike operations area.
And what does that mean practically?
At that point, seafarers have the legal right to refuse to sail into the zone, and they must be repatriated at the company's expense. You cannot force a civilian crew to sail into a minefield, no matter how fully insured the steel hull beneath them is.
But surely there are risk-tolerant captains, mercenary crews. I mean, money usually finds a way.
You'd think so, but moving a massive modern chemical tanker isn't like driving a rogue pickup truck. It requires highly specialized, certified crews, port state controls, classification society approvals.
You can't just hand the keys to some random guy off the street.
Exactly. The logistics of going rogue with a sovereign backstop are nearly impossible, and the physical security simply isn't there to back up the financial guarantee.
What about the U.S. Navy? Isn't their entire global mandate to keep the sea lanes open?
The U.S. Navy is incredibly capable, but they are dealing with a severe asset mismatch. Navy officials were quoted candidly stating they were simply not ready for massive commercial convoy escorts.
Why not?
They had largely retired their dedicated Avenger-class minesweeping vessels by 2025. You can have a billion-dollar Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, but if you don't have the specific, tedious capability to clear cheap $2,000 floating naval mines from a commercial shipping lane, the lane remains closed.
Wow. And what about allies?
Furthermore, key allies like Japan and Australia publicly declined to participate in escort coalitions, citing their own domestic legal frameworks and risk assessments.
So let me get this straight. Even with the $20 billion financial backstop sitting right there on the table, if the Navy cannot physically guarantee safe passage and the civilian crews refuse to take the physical risk, the molecular flow of fertilizer remains completely halted.
Complete paralysis. And this brings us to the crucial element of time. Insurance markets and risk models do not heal overnight.
Right, even if the shooting stops today.
Exactly. Even if there were a magical diplomatic ceasefire signed tomorrow morning, actuaries require 30 to 60 days of absolute, incident-free stability before premiums even begin to incrementally normalize. The treaties have to be renegotiated.
And while the diplomats argue, and the actuaries run their spreadsheets in London, and the military planners reposition their fleets, the natural world does not care. A seed does not care about a Solvency II directive.
This is the core tragedy of the hydrogen trap. We are dealing with biological deadlines. Agriculture is governed by planetary physics. It is governed by photosynthesis, by soil temperature, by the accumulation of growing degree days. These are hard, uncompromising biological clocks.
Walk us through the timing on this. Why is March 2026 such a catastrophic moment for this blockade to happen?
In the Northern Hemisphere, the spring planting window opens in early March. Let's look at the American Corn Belt, which is the cornerstone of global grain production. To maximize yield, an Iowa farmer has to get their nitrogen applied and their corn seed into the ground during a very specific window between mid-April and late May.
What happens if they just wait? Say the blockade clears up in June, the fertilizer arrives, and they plant in June.
Agronomy doesn't allow for pauses. If you plant in June, the growing season is truncated. The corn plant will not accumulate enough thermal energy, what we call growing degree days, before the autumn frosts arrive.
So it literally won't finish growing.
The plant will fail to reach physiological maturity. Agronomists have mapped this out meticulously. Every single day of delay past the optimal planting date results in a progressive, irreversible reduction in the final harvest yield.
And it's not just America, right?
The math is equally unforgiving globally. India is preparing for their massive Kharif planting season. Australia is preparing to sow their winter crop of wheat and barley. These deadlines are set by the tilt of the Earth's axis. They cannot be renegotiated at a peace summit.
So we have a geopolitical vacuum, an entirely fractured maritime insurance market, and a relentlessly ticking biological clock.
What is the immediate result at the farm gate? What does the farmer actually see happening to their input costs?
Absolute chaos in the pricing structure. In New Orleans, which is the major pricing hub for North America, urea barges spiked to $620 per short ton almost instantly.
That's a 30% jump in a matter of days.
Yes. And hydrous ammonia, the pure stuff, hit $895 per ton. In Australia, which imports heavily, prices reached 1,200 Australian dollars per ton. That's up more than 45%. Let's put that in perspective for an American farmer. If you are staring down anhydrous ammonia at nearly $900 a ton, and you look at the Chicago Board of Trade and see new crop corn futures sitting around $4.50 a bushel, the math simply doesn't work. The American Farm Bureau puts the basic break-even cost of growing corn at around $5 a bushel in a normal year.
The margins collapse entirely. Planting corn becomes a structurally unprofitable proposition across large swaths of the American heartland. When farmers face that math, their rational economic response is acreage substitution.
Switching crops.
Right. Corn is a highly nitrogen-intensive crop. It requires roughly 150 to 200 pounds of applied nitrogen per acre just to hit trendline yields. So farmers look at alternatives. Soybeans, for example, are legumes.
All right, we mentioned this earlier. They pull nitrogen from the air.
They have a symbiotic relationship with bacteria in their roots that allows them to fix their own nitrogen from the atmosphere. They require minimal, if any, synthetic nitrogen fertilizer.
So millions of acres that were supposed to be corn suddenly get switched to soybeans. That radically alters the global grain supply. But acreage substitution is just the visible adjustment.
What about the farmers who have to plant corn, maybe because of crop rotation requirements, but they just decide to use less fertilizer because it's too expensive? The rate reduction.
This is where we uncover a catastrophic error in how the world models food security. This is where systems thinking is absolutely vital to understand the true existential threat of this crisis. We have to talk about the quadratic cliff.
Okay, let's unpack the quadratic cliff, because this is the part of the analysis that completely changed how I view agricultural economics.
If you look at institutional analysts, macroeconomists, or government policymakers, they are typically trained in linear mathematics. They like straight lines.
Proportions.
Exactly. So they look at the Hormuz blockade and they assume a proportional relationship. Okay, the global supply of fertilizer is going to drop by 20%. Therefore, we should model that global crop yields will drop by roughly 20%. I mean, it sounds incredibly logical in a spreadsheet.
It does, but agronomy is not linear. A plant is a biological organism, not a factory widget. The yield response of cereal crops to nitrogen application follows a quadratic function. It's a curve with diminishing marginal returns. A massive 2022 study published in Nature Food synthesized data from 25 long-term field experiments all over the globe, and it proved this dynamic definitively.
Let's visualize this curve for the listener.
Imagine a graph where the horizontal axis is how much fertilizer you apply and the vertical axis is how much crop you harvest. As you start adding fertilizer to nutrient-poor soil, the crop yield shoots straight up. It's a very steep ascending line.
Makes sense.
But as you keep adding more and more fertilizer, the plant eventually has all the nitrogen it can efficiently use. The line starts to curve, flattening out at the top into a plateau. Any extra fertilizer you add at that point doesn't give you much extra yield. It just washes away into the watershed.
Okay, I see the curve.
In highly developed agricultural systems like the U.S. Corn Belt or France or Germany, farmers have access to credit and cheap inputs. They typically apply nitrogen at or even slightly above the economic optimum. They are operating right on the flat apex of that quadratic curve.
So they have a massive buffer built into their system.
Exactly. If an Iowa farmer is forced by high prices to reduce their nitrogen application by 15%, they are just sliding slightly backward along the flat top of that curve. The actual penalty to their final crop yield might be incredibly minor, maybe a 2 to 5% drop.
Wow, so barely anything.
And that's before you even factor in precision agriculture technologies. We have variable rate application systems deployed on roughly 70% of major U.S. crop acres.
Explain how variable rate application works, because it's basically a cheat code for this crisis.
It's incredible technology. Instead of spraying a uniform amount of fertilizer across a whole 500-acre field, the tractor uses GPS, historical yield maps, and active soil sampling to dynamically adjust the spray nozzles second by second.
It's customizing it on the fly.
Exactly. It puts more nitrogen on the highly productive soil zones and less on the poor zones. It optimizes every single drop. So for the American farmer, this Hormuz blockade is a severe economic squeeze. It is an inflation event, but it is not a famine. They have the technology and the buffer to survive a 15% cut.
But the global food system isn't just Iowa and France. What happens when you look at the global south? What happens to the smallholder farmers?
That is where the linear math becomes brutally, catastrophically wrong. Let's look at sub-Saharan Africa. The average fertilizer application there is less than 20 kilograms per hectare. That is roughly 1/7 of the global average.
1/7.
Or look at millions of smallholder farmers in South Asia. Because of cost constraints, they are already operating far below the optimal level.
So they aren't sitting comfortably on the flat top of the quadratic curve. They are hanging on to the steep vertical ascent of the curve.
Precisely. For a farmer operating on that steep ascent, a 15% reduction in fertilizer supply doesn't mean a minor 5% drop in yield.
Yeah.
It pushes crop development right off a cliff. Every single kilogram of nitrogen you remove produces a disproportionate accelerating destruction of yield.
Why is the biological penalty so severe?
Because a lack of early-stage nitrogen physically stunts the root biomass of the plant. If the roots don't grow deep and wide, the plant's entire vascular system is compromised. A plant with stunted roots suffers a 20 to 40% reduction in its ability to take up water and other essential nutrients from the soil.
So you aren't just starving it of nitrogen. You are structurally crippling its ability to drink and feed itself for the rest of its life cycle.
Exactly.
This makes so much sense when you compare it to human nutrition. If you take an Olympic swimmer who is consuming 6,000 calories a day and you suddenly take away 1,000 calories, they might feel a little sluggish. They might miss their personal best time by a fraction of a second. It's a penalty, sure. But if you take a person who is barely surviving on 1,500 calories a day and you take away 1,000 calories, you aren't just slowing them down. You are pushing their body into organ failure. It is an existential crisis.
That analogy perfectly captures the asymmetry of this shock, and we do not have to theorize about what this looks like in the real world. The source material points to a terrifying natural experiment that happened in Sri Lanka in 2021.
The organic farming mandate.
Yes. The Sri Lankan government, facing foreign exchange issues and guided by some very flawed advisory councils, imposed a sudden nationwide ban on synthetic fertilizer imports. They mandated an overnight shift to organic farming.
And what actually happened to the harvest? Did the yields just drop linearly by a few percentage points?
The yields collapsed. Rice production plummeted by roughly 20 to 50%, depending on the specific region and the season. Their primary maha harvest dropped approximately 40% year over year. The economic devastation was absolute.
40%.
Domestic rice prices surged. The country had to drain its precious foreign exchange reserves to buy emergency food imports just to stop starvation. The resulting economic implosion directly contributed to mass protests and the eventual collapse of the entire Sri Lankan government.
And that devastation was just from one single country implementing a bad domestic policy.
Yeah.
We are now talking about the exact same physical dynamic, the sudden removal of synthetic nitrogen, replicating at a global scale across dozens of vulnerable nations simultaneously.
And it's worse, because the global market is fiercely, ruthlessly competitive. When the total pie shrinks, the remaining slices don't get distributed equally based on need.
No, of course not.
The marginal ton of available urea flows to the highest bidder on the spot market. It flows to the nation with the deepest pockets, not to the most calorie-sensitive farming system.
So a country like India can just open the treasury and outbid everyone else. Egypt can subsidize their imports at an enormous fiscal cost, taking on massive debt to prevent bread riots.
Yes. But consider a country like Sudan. The analysis notes that Sudan is already facing a confirmed catastrophic famine, with 21.2 million people facing severe food insecurity. They have absolutely no mechanism, no hard currency, to compete on the global spot market for $900 a ton urea.
So the architecture of this fertilizer shock is structurally designed to inflict the absolute maximum physical damage on the populations least capable of absorbing it.
Yeah.
The rich pay inflation, the poor face starvation. It is an incredibly dark reality.
It is.
And yet, incredibly, this is only the agricultural side of the nitrogen trap. If we step back, if we actually use the systems thinking mandate of this deep dive, we enter the territory of the lateral shocks, the 14 dominoes.
This is where consensus modeling fails completely. A standard commodity analyst looks at the Hormuz blockade and says, Gulf gas supply is disrupted, therefore nitrogen fertilizer prices rise, therefore global food prices follow.
Right, line A to line B.
And that is true, but it captures maybe 1/3 of the actual crisis. A true systems perspective reveals 14 distinct transmission channels. We are looking at cascading failures across industries that seem, on the surface, totally unrelated to farming or the Middle East.
Let's walk through these dominoes, because this is the part of the analysis that completely blew my mind. It shows how wired together everything is. The first domino is obvious, nitrogen. We just spent 20 minutes covering that. But the second domino, this is the hidden killer, sulfur.
What's fascinating here is how intertwined our base industrial chemical processes are. The Persian Gulf doesn't just produce natural gas, they refine massive quantities of sour crude oil.
Right.
When you refine sour crude to make usable gasoline or diesel, you absolutely must remove the sulfur to meet global environmental emissions standards. That desulfurization process generates mountains of elemental sulfur as an industrial byproduct.
And because the Gulf refines so much sour crude, they end up producing about half of the globally traded elemental sulfur.
Okay, but why does a farmer in Brazil or a miner in Australia care about sulfur? Because of phosphate fertilizer. Plants need 3 primary macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, NPK. We talked about nitrogen. To get phosphorus, you have to mine raw phosphate rock from the earth.
Okay.
But you cannot just crush up rocks and sprinkle them on a cornfield. The phosphorus is locked in a chemical structure the plant can't access. You have to process that raw rock using a highly corrosive chemical solvent.
And that solvent is sulfuric acid.
Exactly. And you need elemental sulfur to manufacture sulfuric acid. So without the steady flow of Gulf sulfur, the entire global phosphate supply chain fractures. And this affects countries that actually possess their own domestic phosphate rock.
Like who?
Look at Morocco. Morocco's OCP group is the world's largest exporter of phosphate. They literally sit on the largest reserves of phosphate rock on the planet. But to process it, they have to import roughly 3.7 million tons of sulfur annually, largely from the Gulf.
Wow.
China mines massive amounts of phosphate, but they import roughly 4 million tons of sulfur.
So even if you have the rock in your own backyard, without the Gulf sulfur, you are completely stuck. And how did China react to this sudden sulfur bottleneck in March 2026?
They reacted exactly how a rational, self-interested state would react. To stabilize their own domestic agricultural sector ahead of the spring planting season, Beijing directed an administrative suspension of all phosphate fertilizer exports.
They just shut the door.
They essentially walled off their domestic supply, removing an estimated 4.5 million tons of phosphate from the global market overnight.
So we have a devastating global pincer movement on agriculture. Hormuz physically traps the nitrogen. The resulting sulfur shortage chokes off phosphate processing globally. And then, as a secondary effect, China administratively bans phosphate exports. Farmers are suddenly facing a simultaneous disruption of multiple primary nutrient complexes at the exact same moment.
And the sulfur domino does not stop at agriculture. Sulfuric acid is the most widely used industrial chemical on Earth. A massive portion of it is used in base metal production. Yeah. Roughly 20% of annual global copper production relies on acid leaching processes. Indonesia produces over 50% of the world's nickel, which is an absolutely vital component for electric vehicle batteries. And Indonesia reportedly imports the vast majority of their elemental sulfur from Qatar and the UAE.
That is the ultimate butterfly effect.
Right.
A naval mine in the Strait of Hormuz directly threatens the raw materials needed for the global energy transition.
Right.
Because you can't build an EV battery without nickel, and you can't leach the nickel without sulfuric acid, and you can't make the acid without Gulf sulfur. It is wild.
It's all connected.
But let's bring it closer to home. Let's look at the third domino, the petrochemical system. How does this impact the average listener who's just going to the grocery store?
Well, the Middle East is the world's largest exporting region for polyethylene and other base petrochemicals. The massive cracking facilities in Asia, in places like South Korea, Singapore, and China, rely heavily on naphtha feedstock exported from the Gulf. When the strait closed, those Asian petrochemical hubs were instantly starved of raw materials.
And what happened to those plants?
We saw an immediate wave of force majeure declarations. They literally had to spin down the turbines and shut off the machines that crack the hydrocarbon molecules to make plastics.
And polyethylene, polypropylene, PE resin, these are the core foundational components of modern disposable packaging.
Exactly. So think about the grocery store. Every single plastic wrapper around a loaf of bread, every plastic milk jug, the plastic clamshell holding your berries, the shrink-wrapped tray holding chicken breasts, the cost of manufacturing that packaging is suddenly surging.
So the retail price of food at the supermarket will rise just based on the packaging costs alone, entirely independent of the underlying agricultural commodity prices. The farmer might be going bankrupt, but the consumer's still paying more because the plastic box costs twice as much to make.
It acts as an unavoidable, invisible inflation multiplier across the entire fast-moving consumer goods sector.
That brings us to the fourth domino, which I think is genuinely the most terrifying part of this entire analysis. The pharmaceutical supply chain. I never, in a million years, would have connected a fertilizer choke point to medicine.
It is a critical, highly concentrated vulnerability. Modern medicine is heavily reliant on chemistry, and a large majority of active pharmaceutical ingredients, what we call APIs, chemical feedstocks, and reagents, are ultimately derived from petrochemicals. You need solvents, you need synthetic precursors.
And India is an absolute powerhouse in this space, right?
India is the pharmacy of the world. They produce roughly 20% of all global generic drugs by volume. More critically, for Western listeners, India supplies approximately 40% of the total generic drug demand in the United States.
Wow, 40%.
Yeah.
But to make those millions of pills, India needs those petrochemical feedstocks from the Gulf? And they also need raw energy to run the massive pharmaceutical factories.
Yes, and the analysis notes a brutal triage occurring in India. As liquefied natural gas, LNG, imports from Qatar were disrupted, the Indian government had to make a choice.
What choice?
They prioritized household cooking gas, LPG, for their citizens over allocating industrial petrochemical feedstocks to the factories. You keep the citizens cooking their dinner, but you starve the industrial base.
So if this blockade in Hormuz drags on for 3, 4, or 6 months, we aren't just looking at expensive corn and expensive plastic packaging. We are looking at a scenario where Indian pharmaceutical manufacturers simply run out of the raw chemical materials needed to synthesize generic antibiotics, blood pressure medications, antidepressants, everything.
Now, Indian pharmaceutical companies generally hold about 3 to 6 months of finished product and raw material stock as a buffer. So the pharmacy shelves don't go empty on day one, but that buffer depletes rapidly.
Still, that's a ticking clock.
This transmission channel is completely invisible to commodity analysts who are just staring at grain futures on a Bloomberg terminal. But the humanitarian implications of a global shortage in basic antibiotics could easily rival the agricultural impact.
The interconnectedness is just staggering. And there's so many other dominoes in this stack.
Right.
Let's talk about the AdBlue crisis in Australia. Explain that one because it perfectly illustrates how a modern, hyper-efficient logistics network can just freeze in place.
AdBlue, which is also known as diesel exhaust fluid, or DEF, is an absolute requirement for modern heavy diesel engines to operate. It is a chemical injected into the exhaust stream to break down harmful nitrogen oxide emissions, allowing the trucks to meet strict environmental standards.
And the engines are literally programmed to shut down if they run out of it, right?
Yes. The engine control unit has a software lock. If the AdBlue tank runs dry, the truck will electronically limit its speed to a crawl or simply refuse to start entirely. You cannot bypass it. Now, what is AdBlue made of? It is a solution of highly purified urea and deionized water.
Urea again. And where does Australia get its urea?
Australia imports virtually all of its urea, and roughly 2/3 of those imports originate from the Middle East. When Hormuz closed, Australia's urea pipeline was instantly severed. Without that urea, they cannot make AdBlue. Without AdBlue, their entire heavy freight network, the massive road trains that move food, fuel, and medical supplies across the continent, faces the threat of total paralysis.
The trucks literally will not start. The grocery store shelves go empty not because there is no food, but because the diesel trucks are electronically locked out of moving.
It is a vulnerability hidden in plain sight. And the dominoes keep falling. Look at the desalination domino. You have nations like Kuwait, which depends on energy-intensive desalination plants for upwards of 90% of its municipal drinking water.
90%.
If energy supplies are disrupted, or if the water infrastructure itself is threatened by kinetic strikes in the Gulf, you have millions of people facing acute water crises in the desert.
And then there's the sovereign debt domino.
Yeah.
Because all of this disruption costs money.
Enormous amounts of money. Take Egypt. Egypt is the world's largest wheat importer. Their population relies heavily on heavily subsidized bread. As global grain supplies tighten and prices rise, Egypt's import bill skyrockets. But Egypt is simultaneously facing $28 billion in external debt repayments.
A perfect storm.
Or look at sub-Saharan Africa facing a collective $90 billion sovereign debt wall.
These systems are perfectly reflexive. They feed on each other. A sulfur shortage in the Gulf raises phosphate prices globally. That causes China to panic and ban their own exports. That raises fertilizer costs for everyone, which makes American farmers plant less corn and more soybeans, which tightens the global grain supply, which raises the food import bills for a country like Egypt, which crashes their currency, which means the Egyptian government can no longer afford to subsidize fertilizer for their own domestic farmers, which lowers their domestic harvest even further, forcing them to import even more expensive grain. It is a perfect, inescapable doom loop.
It is a doom loop. And just as human economic and political systems are buckling under the weight of these 14 dominoes, the natural world decides to introduce a massive, completely uncontrollable stress multiplier: the weather.
Right. Let's move to Section 5, the weather multiplier. Because the timing of this geopolitical crisis in the spring and summer of 2026 couldn't possibly be worse from a meteorological standpoint.
The analysis highlights a truly catastrophic convergence of events. Let's start with the immediate, localized weather. In the United States, the crucial spring planting season is beginning with over half of the major corn-growing areas already experiencing some level of drought. The Ohio Valley and the southern Midwest just recorded their driest meteorological winter on record.
The soil moisture profile is already depleted before the CE even goes into the ground. But the bigger, much more terrifying issue is the macro climate shift, the ENSO transition.
Exactly, the El Niño Southern Oscillation. For the past cycle, we have been in a La Niña pattern, but the models show La Niña rapidly fading, and global forecasters strongly favor the emergence of El Niño by the June through August window of 2026.
Okay.
And the data, specifically massive subsurface ocean warming in the equatorial Pacific, suggests a high probability of it becoming a very strong El Niño event.
And historically, what does a strong El Niño mean for global agriculture?
It is highly disruptive, but it is particularly devastating for specific regions, most notably India. El Niño historically suppresses the Indian summer monsoon. SkyMet, which is India's leading private weather forecasting agency, has already assigned a 60% likelihood of below normal monsoon rainfall for the 2026 season.
Think about the compounding effect of that. India's Kharif season, their main summer crop, relies heavily on those monsoon rains. They are now facing a scenario where they have no affordable fertilizer coming from the Gulf and no water coming from the sky.
And here is where we have to return to the agronomy, because the relationship between these two deficits is absolutely critical to understand. Nitrogen deficiency and water stress do not interact additively. They interact multiplicatively.
Break that down. What does that actually mean for the plant in the field?
If you have a crop that is missing 20% of its required fertilizer, you are going to lose some yield, let's say a 10% loss. If that same crop is fully fertilized but experiences a moderate drought, you also lose some yield, say another 10%.
Okay, so a linear model would say 10 plus 10 is 20.
A linear model would say that if you combine both, you lose 20%. But biological reality says the yield loss will be vastly greater than the sum of those two parts. It might be a 40 or 50% loss.
Oh, why? Why is the combination so lethal?
It goes back to the root system again. A nitrogen-deficient plant cannot build a robust root architecture. The roots are shallow, weak, and stunted. So when the drought hits and the top layer of soil dries out, a well-fertilized plant can push its strong roots deep into the subsoil to find whatever residual moisture is left. It can survive.
Yeah.
But the starving plant, with its stunted roots, literally cannot physically reach the water sitting just a few inches below it.
The interaction term dominates the equation. A healthy plant can survive a drought, a starving plant just dies. And again, the consensus economic models systematically ignore this multiplicative effect.
Which brings us directly back to the concept of sovereign detonators. We talked about India outbidding others on the spot market for fertilizer, but we have to look at the internal cost of that action.
The fiscal bleeding.
It's a staggering fiscal cost. The Indian government allocated roughly $18.6 billion for fertilizer subsidies for this fiscal year. They buy fertilizer at the volatile global price, and they sell it to their farmers at a heavily subsidized, fixed low rate. It ensures food security.
But with international prices surging 40, 50, 60%, the government treasury has to absorb that massive delta.
Exactly. And they can't even ramp up their own domestic production to offset it because their domestic factories run on LNG gas imported from Qatar.
Right.
The government had to cap natural gas allocations to industry. They literally forced major fertilizer plants in regions like Punjab to halt operations entirely so they could route the gas to power plants to keep the electrical grid from collapsing. They are burning through their strategic stockpiles from both ends.
And if India is struggling, look at Bangladesh. Bangladesh is in an even more precarious position.
Bangladesh is a textbook example of a fragile system being overwhelmed. 4 to 5 of their major domestic urea factories were ordered to shut down due to severe government gas rationing. Only one major facility, the Shajala plant, was reportedly operational.
Wow.
They are bleeding over 7,000 tons of daily production capacity, and this is happening right in the middle of their Boro rice season, which is absolutely vital because it accounts for more than half of their total annual grain output.
And unlike India, Bangladesh does not have massive foreign exchange reserves. They kind of just hop onto the international spot market and buy emergency urea at $700 a ton.
No, they don't have the currency reserves. And to make matters worse, their primary economic engine, the ready-made garment sector, which generates 85% of their export earnings and provides millions of jobs, is simultaneously facing its own crisis.
How so?
They are dealing with disruptions in global cotton supply and shortages of the Gulf petrochemicals needed to manufacture synthetic fabrics like polyester.
It is a compound shock. The food supply is collapsing, and the primary source of national income is stalling at the exact same time. How do governments even begin to triage a crisis like this? Put yourself in the shoes of a leader in one of these developing nations. You have to choose. Do we route our limited natural gas to the power plants to keep the lights on and stop rolling blackouts? Do we allocate it to the industrial factories to keep people employed and prevent economic collapse? Or do we divert that gas to the fertilizer plant so we can actually grow food for next year?
It is an impossible triage. There is no mathematical solution that doesn't result in massive suffering. It is the brutal reality of absolute resource constraint. And as the analysis repeatedly emphasizes, this crisis is selectively brutal.
Selectively brutal.
The United States might be fine, Europe might manage through it, but the 318 million people facing crisis-level hunger globally today are not fine. The disruption in Hormuz threatens to push another 100 to 200 million people into acute, severe food insecurity within a matter of months.
Okay, we have painted an incredibly grim picture. We've mapped out a cascading systemic failure. But as a responsible deep dive, we have to look at all sides of the equation. We need to look at the adversarial case. Is it possible that the market is overreacting? Are the alarm bells ringing too loudly? Let's take a hard look at the counter-arguments to this catastrophe thesis.
An honest, rigorous analysis must always engage with the strongest counter-evidence, and the case against a catastrophic, civilization-ending outcome rests on some very strong pillars, particularly when you look at the developed world.
We mentioned the U.S. resilience earlier. Let's dig deeper into that.
The United States is incredibly insulated compared to the rest of the world. The U.S. produces roughly 65 to 75% of the total nitrogen fertilizer it consumes.
That's a huge domestic supply.
And they do it utilizing their own abundant, incredibly cheap domestic natural gas from places like the Permian Basin and the Marcellus Shale.
So the U.S. isn't fundamentally reliant on the Persian Gulf for the core molecules in the same way Europe, India, or Asia is. We have the feedstock right under our feet.
Correct. Furthermore, the U.S. agricultural logistics system is highly advanced and forward-looking. Farming in America is a massive corporate enterprise. Many American farmers, or the major cooperatives that supply them, pre-ordered and physically took delivery of their spring 2026 fertilizer in the autumn of 2025.
Oh, wow. They already have it.
Major agricultural retailers had 85 to 90% of their required product already sitting safely in warehouses in the upper Midwest months before the first missile was fired in the Gulf.
And we talked about precision agriculture, the variable rate application systems, the ability to just use less fertilizer more intelligently.
That technology is a massive buffer. Projects conducted by universities in Nebraska have proven through field trials that farmers can cut their nitrogen application by up to 33 pounds per acre while maintaining the exact same final yield simply by relying on GPS soil mapping to apply the fertilizer more efficiently.
So for the U.S. agricultural machine, this crisis is a cost headache. It is an inflation event that will hit the consumer.
Yeah.
But it is absolutely not a physical shortage of calories.
Exactly.
What about the physical blockade itself? Is Iran actually sinking every single ship that approaches the strait?
No, and this is a crucial nuance. Iran appears to be executing a highly selective blockade, not a total indiscriminate one. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps reportedly explicitly narrowed their target profile to vessels flagged to, owned by, or destined for the U.S., Israel, and specific Western allies.
So they are letting Chinese-flagged ships pass through safely.
Exactly. The Chinese diplomatic relationship with Iran provides a shield for their logistics. India has also reportedly negotiated safe passage for specific fertilizer vessels. This selective permeability means the blockade isn't absolute. It allows some molecular flow to continue.
It is devastating for Western shipping conglomerates, but it means the global supply of fertilizer hasn't gone to absolute zero.
Right. And also, the text mentions that the global supply of potash, the K in the NPK fertilizer mix, is actually expanding.
Expanding.
Yeah, Belarus, which is a massive producer, is returning to full capacity after logistical bottlenecks. And Russia is still exporting massive volumes of fertilizer, over 33 million tons annually, primarily directing it to friendly nations in the BRICS coalition.
So we have all these powerful mitigants: U.S. domestic production, precision agriculture, pre-positioned warehouse stocks, a leaky blockade, and alternative supplies from Russia. If all of that is true, why is the author of this analysis still so deeply alarmed? Are they just being sensational?
They are alarmed because the market is suffering from a fundamental, massive anchoring error regarding the duration of the crisis.
That's duration.
Yes. Institutional capital allocators and commodity analysts are looking at the situation and treating it like a direct replay of the 2022 Russia-Ukraine fertilizer shock.
Human nature. We always fight the last war. In 2022, prices spiked, everyone panicked, but then demand destruction kicked in, trade flows rerouted, and eventually the market settled back down. They assume 2026 will follow the exact same arc.
Exactly. But the 2026 Hormuz crisis is structurally, mechanically different in every single dimension that actually matters.
Let's break down those differences point by point. Why is 2026 not 2022?
First, the physical reality of the molecules. In 2022, Russian fertilizer was heavily sanctioned by the West, but the molecules themselves physically continued to flow. Russia utilized shadow fleets of aging tankers, they used intermediary traders in places like Turkey and the UAE, and they pivoted to alternative markets like Brazil and India.
Right. The fertilizer was rerouted on a map. It was not removed from the earth.
Exactly. It took a longer, more expensive way around, but it still got out of the port and onto a farm somewhere. In 2026, the molecules in the Persian Gulf are physically trapped behind a geographic choke point that is seeded with naval mines and, crucially, is commercially uninsured.
There is no alternative pipeline to reroute them through.
The molecules are stuck in the storage tanks. Secondly, we have to look at the farm economics. In 2022, when fertilizer prices surged, global grain prices surged right alongside them. Wheat prices went up over 50% as the Black Sea was disrupted.
So even though the farmer was paying vastly more for their inputs, they were also making vastly more money when they sold their harvest. Their profit margin, their incentive to plant, stayed relatively intact.
Yes. But the Persian Gulf, unlike the Black Sea, is not a major grain exporter. So in the 2026 crisis, grain prices have not rallied commensurately with the fertilizer spike. Farmers are being violently squeezed entirely from the cost side with virtually zero revenue offset to protect them.
Ouch. And the most important difference, the timeline.
The timeline is the killer. The 2022 crisis built gradually over months of troop buildups and diplomatic warnings. The global supply chain had time to adapt, to build up inventory buffers, to adjust logistics.
They saw it coming.
Right. The 2026 Hormuz closure was effectively instantaneous, and it arrived directly inside the Northern Hemisphere spring planting window. There was zero time for adaptation.
So the market is looking at this and thinking, oh, this is a 45-day geopolitical disruption. It will blow over. But the structural realities, the complete fracture of the insurance market, the physical lack of naval minesweeping assets, the uncompromising biological deadlines, all point to a disruption of 120 days or more.
And this brings us right back to the fundamental asymmetry we discussed earlier. The counterarguments, the U.S. domestic natural gas production, the GPS tractors, the warehouse buffers, they only provide comfort to the developed world.
Right. The smallholder farmer in South Asia doesn't have a $500,000 variable rate GPS tractor. Government of Sudan doesn't have billions of dollars in domestic natural gas subsidies to fall back on. A crisis is selectively destroying the most vulnerable populations, while the global market averages the data out and concludes that everything is fine.
And you can see this cognitive dissonance in how the capital markets reacted. Capital immediately surged into the visible beneficiaries of the crisis.
The producers outside the Gulf.
Right. North American nitrogen producers, companies like CF Industries, saw their stocks surge 35% almost immediately. They became the top-performing stocks in the S&P 500 for the month.
Because they have access to cheap U.S. natural gas to make their ammonia, but they get to sell their fertilizer at the sky-high global price dictated by the Hormuz shortage. They are absolutely printing money.
Yes, that commodity price windfall flows directly to their bottom line. But that visible windfall also triggers severe political blowback.
I can imagine.
The text notes politicians like Senator Josh Hawley citing a 32% surge in retail urea prices and publicly alleging corporate price gouging. The Department of Justice began opening antitrust inquiries into major fertilizer producers to investigate anti-competitive behavior.
But the analysis is very careful to categorize this as a timing risk for investors, not a thesis risk. Fertilizer prices are set by global supply and demand dynamics. CF Industries didn't deploy naval mines in the Strait of Hormuz. They are just the beneficiary of the resulting scarcity.
Exactly. The political and regulatory headwinds are very real for investors holding those equities. But political hearings do not alter the underlying physical reality of the crisis. The molecules in the Gulf are trapped, and the world is starting for them.
Okay, this brings us to the most important part of this entire deep dive, Section 7. Systems mitigations and structural reform. We have spent the last hour mapping out the 14 dominoes, the weather multipliers, the fractured insurance markets, and the biological clocks. How do we actually fix this architecture? How do we build the fail-safe system for our food that we forgot to build 50 years ago?
The source text outlines a synthesis of the structural reforms that are absolutely required to prevent this exact scenario from happening again. The first, and perhaps most conceptually obvious mitigation, is the creation of strategic fertilizer reserves.
Treating fertilizer exactly like we treat crude oil, the strategic petroleum reserve model.
Exactly. After the devastating oil shocks of the 1970s, the industrialized world realized that energy security was national security. So we built massive physical stockpiles of crude oil to buffer against geopolitical disruptions. We need to adopt that exact same doctrine for agriculture. Governments must build and maintain massive physical stockpiles of nitrogen, phosphate, and potash.
But the logistics of storing fertilizer are vastly more complicated than storing oil, aren't they? You can't just pump ammonia into a hollowed-out salt cavern and leave it there for a decade.
You are absolutely right. The engineering challenges are immense. Nitrogen, particularly in the form of anhydrous ammonia, requires highly specialized, pressurized, or heavily refrigerated storage tanks. It is a hazardous, volatile chemical.
And what about urea?
Urea, the solid granular form, degrades over time and absorbs moisture from the air, turning into a giant, unusable block. It requires dedicated, climate-controlled warehousing infrastructure built on a massive national scale.
So it's going to cost billions of dollars just to build the warehouses.
It will be incredibly expensive. But you have to weigh that cost against the alternative. It is a fraction of the cost of a systemic collapse of the global food supply.
Okay, what is the second structural mitigation?
Geographic diversification of production. Right now, as we discussed, the entire haber bosch industry is geographically concentrated wherever there is cheap, abundant natural gas. We have a geographic monopoly. We need to completely decouple fertilizer production from fossil fuel choke points.
But how do you do that if the process fundamentally requires the hydrogen from methane gas?
Through massive, aggressive investments in green ammonia facilities, green ammonia bypasses natural gas entirely. It uses massive banks of electrolyzers, powered entirely by renewable energy, wind, solar, or hydro, to extract the necessary hydrogen directly from water molecules.
That is incredible. So if you don't need natural gas pipelines, you could theoretically put a green ammonia plant anywhere you have sunlight, wind, and water. You could build a massive facility safely in the middle of the Australian outback or the American plains, thousands of miles away from any vulnerable geopolitical straits.
Precisely. It breaks the geographic monopoly. It democratizes the production of the most vital molecule for human survival.
But there's a catch, right?
Yes, the caveat is that green ammonia is currently much more expensive to produce. It requires roughly twice the energy equivalent of conventional fossil fuel haber bosch production. But the option value of having distributed, non-choke point dependent fertilizer assets is now permanently elevated by this crisis. The premium you pay for green ammonia is the premium you pay for national security.
Okay, mitigation number 3. Let's talk about the insurance fracture. How do we fix the paperwork that stopped the ships? Building new green ammonia plants will take decades. Can we force the insurers back into the market faster?
We need foundational insurance reform. The private market, bound by strict regulations like the Solvency II Directive, simply cannot handle the correlated risks of modern asymmetric warfare in critical geopolitical choke points.
Because private capital will always rationally flee when a 1 in 200-year event happens. They're businesses, not charities.
Exactly. So the structural mitigation is the creation of a permanent, institutionalized, sovereign backstop facility designed specifically and exclusively for maritime war risk. Not an improvised, frantic $20 billion package thrown together with Chubb after the missiles start flying, but a permanent, pre-funded global framework.
How would that work in practice?
When commercial insurers pull out of a region or when premiums cross a certain prohibitive threshold, the sovereign backstop automatically engages. It removes the profit motive and simply guarantees the risk, ensuring that critical logistical nodes, the ships carrying food, fertilizer, and medicine, do not collapse due to a lack of private underwriting capacity.
And the final mitigation.
Infrastructure framing. This is fundamentally a paradigm shift in governance and political philosophy. We must shift the policy mindset so that governments treat fertilizer not just as another agricultural commodity traded on a futures exchange, but as critical, vital national infrastructure.
We need to treat it exactly like we treat the electrical grid. Treat it like the municipal water supply. Treat it like telecommunications.
Yes. subject the fertilizer supply chain to the exact same rigorous strategic planning, the same mandatory redundancy requirements, and the same absolute national security protections that govern our energy grids.
Because right now, the global system operates on extreme, hyper-optimized, just-in-time efficiency. Maximize the profit margin, minimize the storage costs, rely on the cheapest producer. But as we've seen so clearly today, extreme efficiency is the enemy of resilience. When a shock hits a highly efficient, rigid system, it doesn't bend, it just shatters.
And here is the sobering, uncompromising reality that the author leaves us with. Absolutely none of these structural fixes, not the strategic reserves, not the green ammonia plants, not the sovereign insurance treaties, none of it will arrive in time to save the spring 2026 planting season.
Right, you can't authorize, permit, and build a multi-billion-dollar green ammonia plant by next Tuesday.
The biological clock has already ticked down, the planting window is closing, the molecules are trapped, the damage is already priced into the soil. But these mitigations are absolutely vital for the long-term survival of our civilization.
We have to start building the lifeboats right now, even if the current ship is already taking on water. It is about preventing the next iteration of the nitrogen trap, because there will be a next time.
Yes, and to take that a step further, it's about recognizing that the trap exists in the first place.
So, to summarize the sheer, terrifying fragility we've uncovered today, the nitrogen trap is an invisible metabolic engine that keeps 4 billion people alive. We centralized its production in one of the most volatile regions on Earth. We made its transportation entirely reliant on a fragile, mathematically rigid, commercially driven maritime insurance market, and we left it ticking down against the uncompromising, irreversible clock of biology.
It is a profound historical failure of systemic architecture. We optimized for cost, and in doing so, we sacrificed our existence.
Which brings me to a final lingering thought for you, the listener, to mull over. The source material makes a brilliant piercing point. We only built the strategic petroleum reserves in the 1970s because the gas shortages were viscerally, undeniably obvious to the public. People sat in their cars in lines, stretching for miles at gas stations. They felt the scarcity.
The threat was highly visible, and therefore it forced political action.
But the fertilizer dependency is, as the author brilliantly puts it, hidden in the soil. It is entirely invisible to policymakers and the average citizen. People know their cars need gas. They understand that mechanical relationship. But they do not inherently know that their bread needs anhydrous ammonia. They don't know that their vegetables require raw phosphate rock processed with Gulf sulfur. They just see food on a grocery store shelf. So if the very foundation of human caloric survival is so dangerously invisible to the average person, what other vital life-sustaining systems are quietly resting on equally uninsurable, unprotected choke points?
We have to ask ourselves, what about the digital architecture governing our municipal water grids?
Exactly. What about the highly concentrated, fragile supply chains of rare earth metals that power every single communication device, every hospital monitor, every defense system on the planet? Are these systems just sitting there waiting for their own geopolitical match to be struck? Are we sleepwalking into another trap simply because we can't see the wires?
It's a systemic question we can no longer afford to ignore. We have to start looking at the invisible architecture of our world before it collapses.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden systems that run our world. We'll see you next time.